So on your Pew Bible, we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark. It is chapter 15, verse 21. In your Pew Bible, it is page 852. 852. And if you stand with me as the Bible is read. Page A52, Mark 15. We'll begin with verse 21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." You may be seated. Now, this is a kind of different kind of text for Palm Sunday, but it does mark a turning point. The idea of triumphal entry, the Palm Sunday really does mark a turning point in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus will stop being hush-hush about his messianic identity. From this point on, from the point on of him entering into Jerusalem, he's going to show openly what being the Messiah is really about. And that is going to blow up all of our expectations. Now, to show what I mean, I want to begin with a question. And the question is this: what costs billions of dollars, but it's virtually worthless? What cost billions of dollars, but it's virtually worthless? Any guesses? No? Well, the answer is this: a second place in a presidential election. A second place. Is that true? Is that not true? Now, according to one estimate, the two parties spent close to $6 billion combined in 2020, and that is just on the presidential candidates alone. That is not counting all the outside groups and all the congressional races. Now, if you count all of them all together, the total cost of 2020 election topped $14 billion. A long time ago, it used to be that if you come in second in the electoral college votes, you get to be the vice president. You guys know that? Yeah. Think about that. Your former bitter political rival ends up to be your closest teammate on the same team. Now, some people would call that poetic justice. But the 12th Amendment in 1804 changed all that. Now you get virtually nothing for finishing second. Now, so far, we've only talked about the dollar amount. We've not considered the total cost of human resources, the armies of volunteers, the armies of pundits on India, the armies of lawyers, right, for legal challenges in the aftermath. So when I think about this, in this year of election, I'm truly amazed by what it takes to be the president of the United States. Politics is the ultimate game of power, of resources, of meticulous calculation and leverage and strategy and image projection and manipulation. In contrast, the path for Jesus to become the Messiah, or the King of the Jews, couldn't be more different. And to say that they are the complete opposites almost feels like an understatement. Now, to appreciate this, we need a quick overview of Mark's narrative strategy. Now, I know I jump into the gospel, so we're going to go through a quick overview. Mark begins his gospel. This is the first line of the gospel by telling us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, in the very first line, verse 1. And yet, at every juncture, just when Jesus does something amazing, and there's an emphasis on amazing things that he did. Miracles, chapter 1 to 5. He casts out demons, he heals the sick, he makes the leper clean. And just when he teaches something amazing, and there's the emphasis on his teaching, from chapter 6 to 13. And just when all these important things happen, he refuses the publicity. For example, chapter 7, he opens the ears of the deaf. Chapter 8, he gives sight to the blind. By the way, there's a two-stage healing of the blind that actually become an interpretive key for the gospel. Some of you may remember this from the last time I was in the Gospel of Mark. And in the same chapter, Peter makes the right confession, you are the Christ, the Messiah. Now, in all three of these instances, all the way to his otherworldly transfiguration with Moses and Elijah in chapter 9, at every critical juncture about his astonishing authority, his astonishing power, Jesus tweets a selfie. No, right? He gives strict order not to tell anyone. Isn't that kind of odd? He says, don't tell anyone. Now, scholars call this motif the messianic secret. Messianic secret. But starting with his triumphal entry in chapter 11, Jesus begins to take on the role of the king openly. By chapter 14, at his trial before the Sanhedrin, Jesus finally says, yes, I am. I'm what? I am the Messiah, Son of the Blessed One. That was the question put to him. I am. And the whole thing culminates in chapter 15 when a Gentile soldier exclaims while he's on the cross, truly, this man was the Son of God. It's kind of the culmination. So Mark tells us from the very first line that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And yet it takes 15 long chapters to finally arrive at that same conclusion. Albeit the pace prompted by Mark's use of the word immediately gets faster and faster and faster. Now you know what the chart means. This whole process, I believe, was meant to encourage us to ask questions. And questions like, so what exactly does it mean that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? What exactly does that mean? What exactly makes him the Messiah? So I believe this so-called messianic secret is not meant to conceal something from us as the readers. But on the contrary, Mark is using this, is incorporating this as a literary device to reveal to us the precise nature of Jesus' messiahship. Not by confirming, but by defying our expectations. It's meant to say something to this effect. Okay, Jesus has incredible authority. Chapter 1 to 5. But is that what makes him the Messiah? The answer, no. Not quite. That's not what makes him the Messiah. Well, how about his unbelievable power, even power over nature? Is that what makes him the Messiah? Not quite. That's not what makes him the Messiah either. So there's this play about not yet. He can teach, he can heal, he can subdue demons, and shine like angels alongside of Moses and Elijah, but none of that makes him the Messiah. What makes him the Messiah is ultimately encapsulated in the Passion Week. Starting from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, he enters Jerusalem like a king, yes. But it is because he enters to suffer and die even the death on the cross, and that's how he becomes the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Now, if you compare that with how a person becomes the President of the United States, the contrast is black and white. And this is especially true when you consider the kind of death that Jesus dies. See, it's not just that he dies, but how he dies. He dies on the cross. It's not just that he suffers, but how he suffers. He suffers the suffering that degrades. There's a stigma, a stench, an ugliness, and shame associated with the cross. By the way, we no longer see or smell or feel or understand. And sometimes in confirmation class or catechism, we ask questions like, why did Jesus have to die? Why did Jesus have to die? Now, that's a good question, but it's not quite on point. A better question, I believe, is, why was Jesus crucified? Why was Jesus... You hear the difference? You see, the emphasis needs to be not just that he died, but how he died. And this is something that we need to think about, because there's no modern analogy, really, to crucifixion. It's hard even to relate to the stigma of the cross. So let me go to theologian Fleming Rutledge on this. She says this. She says, and you can read it you can read it on the screen. She says, if Jesus' demise is construed merely as a death, even as a painful, tortured death, the crucial point will be lost. Crucifixion was specifically designed to be the ultimate insult to personal dignity. The last word in humiliating and dehumanizing treatment. Degradation was the whole point. And after citing many historical sources about what the ancient people thought of crucifixion, she goes on to say this. She says, crucifixion was supposed to be seen by as many people as possible. Debasement resulting from public display was the chief feature of the method, along with prolonging of agony. It was a form of advertisement or public announcement. This person is the scum of the earth, not fit to live, more an insect than a human being. The crucified wretch was pinned up like a specimen. Crosses were not placed out in the open for convenience or sanitation, but for maximum public exposure. Now today we're going to see this feature of public display and also the intentional prolonging of agony. And that sets up a way to understand what the story of Simon the Cyrenian is all about. And then we're going to see how, in a very different way, but in a very real way, the cross is still in the future of every one of us. So let's skip ahead. So I want to just skip ahead a little bit to the scene of Good Friday, where the crucifixion of Jesus takes place. And that is at a place called Golgotha, or Calvary in Latin. And literally, it means the place of the skull, as the text tells us. Now, we don't know exactly where Golgotha is for sure. But what we do know is that it had to be outside of the city walls, because that's how typically both the Romans and the Jews see execution. The idea of execution is a casting out of a criminal from human communities, from community of humanity, outside of the city. And it had to be near major crossroads to be a public spectacle. The intention is to make it highly visible for everyone traveling from every direction into Jerusalem. Now, once they arrived there, verse 23, if you follow me, verse 23, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, and he did not take it. Now, it is true sometimes in the ancient world, sometimes we hear people say this, that wine was given to condemned prisoners as a kind of narcotic to numb their pain. That is true especially from the prisoner's relatives. But don't confuse that with this. This is not an act of mercy. In Luke's parallel account, Luke says this: the soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering sour wine and saying, "If you're the king of Jews, save yourself." It's all part of public shaming. And even if they give him wine to dull the pain, it is not out of mercy. The most likely the intention is to keep him from going into shock in order to prolong his agony. And that's probably why Jesus refuses to take it. Verse 24, and they crucified him. It's just remarkable how brief all four Gospels describe the actual process of nailing Jesus to the cross. Now here Mark uses only 3 words in Greek. Part of this is that people back then were familiar with this process, but I think there's something else. Again, I believe that Mark wants us to focus on something else. Not just the physical pain, but that something else is the stigma and the stench, rather than just the physical pain. It goes on to say this: they divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take, which recalls the suffering of abandonment and degradation in Psalm 22. And this is really from Psalm 22. Now, Psalm 22 is not a psalm about physical pain, but it is about something else. It's as if Mark is saying to us, if you want to know what it feels like to be humiliated, to be debased by man and forsaken by God, Psalm 22. So, verse 25. It was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. That's about 9 in the morning, but the precise timing can be anywhere between 9 and 12. And the inscription, verse 26, of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And this is officially how Jesus becomes the Messiah, the King of the Jews, in utter weakness and shame. Contrast that with how a person becomes the President of the United States. Complete opposite paths. Now, if Mark is brief about the actual nailing of Jesus to the cross, just 3 words, he's not so brief about the person who carries Jesus' cross, Simon of Cyrene. And this is all the more curious if you consider all the possible textual connections that Mark seems to intentionally evoke in the details of this accidental encounter. So let's backtrack now to verse 21. We'll go back a few verses to verse 21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of skull. Not only does Mark name names here, he tells us where he is from. He tells us that he has a family. But it's not just any Simon from Cyrene who has a family. He is the father of 2 specific boys, me, Alexander, and Rufus. I mean, that is a lot of information for a random passerby, don't you think? So, some people guess that the Simon is the same Simon who is called Niger in Acts 13. When we went through the book of Acts, some of you may remember that, Acts 13, verse 1. Simon of Niger. Now, if that is true, then he later became a Christian teacher and a co-worker of Barnabas in the church of Antioch. It's also possible that his son Rufus is the same Rufus Paul mentions in his list of greetings in Romans 16, as he wrote that letter to the church at Rome, which means that his whole family is known to the church at Rome. That is also a possibility. Now remember, both Mark and his source Peter, they were associated with the church at Rome. It certainly seems very random that for Mark to mention the names of Alexander and Rufus here, unless he expects his readers to know who they are. Now, We're still talking about guesses, though, right? We can't know for sure. What we can do is to focus on the clues within the text itself. Now, it's interesting that the word Mark uses for passerby, it is a participle that he uses in a verbal form as well. He uses this word only 2 other times in the gospel, both in the context of Jesus calling his disciples, calling the 12. Now, the first time is Mark 1, verse 16. Passing alongside, passing by the Sea of Galilee. There, that is the verb there. He, meaning Jesus, saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And the second time is Mark chapter 4, verse 14. And as he passed by, and there's that word, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Now, these are the only 3 times that this word is used. The word passerby, passing by. Now, on top of that, the phrase to carry his cross, if we go back to verse 21, that it compelled him, they conscript him to carry his cross. Or literally, the Greek there says he takes up the cross. He takes up his cross. That is verbatim from Mark chapter 8, verse 34, where Jesus said, "If anyone will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross," verbatim, "and follow me." So there seemed to be an intentional connection. And I call Simon the accidental disciple because he, without agreeing to it, he ended up doing all the things that Jesus' disciples are supposed to do. So imagine this. Imagine this. You are Simon from Cyrene. Now, Cyrene was a city in North Africa. Today's Libya, which is North Africa. And during the first century, there was a fairly large Jewish population in Cyrene. Now, with a Hebrew name, and we think it's most likely a Hebrew name, like Simon, even though it could be Greek, apparently, we're probably talking about either someone of Jewish descent or a Gentile with Jewish influence living in North Africa. Either way, the only likely reason a North African would travel to Jerusalem during this time, the bustling and hustling madness of Passover. Now, remember, this is the Passover week. The only reason that they would do that was that he himself was a pilgrim, paying a religious pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In other words, he was going to Jerusalem to have a proper Passover. So imagine this. You are Simon of Cyrene. You've been looking forward to participate in the temple Passover liturgy in person all year. This is important to you. Doing Passover right is on your heart. And this is how you want to be right with God. Now, not all of your Jewish friend or family can make it this year for whatever excuses, but not you. You prioritize your life to make this trip possible. And you do this no matter what. And this is the time to be in Jerusalem. Right? It's important. But after miles and miles of religious, spiritual, and wonderful anticipation, as you get closer and closer to Jerusalem. Now, just when the Temple Mount and the city wall are in sight, and here comes all the commotion of soldiers and mob and crowds and some random Jewish troublemaker. They're heading in the opposite direction and on their way to be crucified. What a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad timing. You have to understand, the whole business of crucifixion was so repugnant that the very word cross in Latin, crux, it was an obscenity in the first century. You never use that word in a company of respectable people. You teach your kids never to swear it, because with that word, you make all the theater PG-13. But now you bump into some rough Roman soldiers who conscript you, force you to carry that very obscenity across for a mess of a criminal. I mean, you were on your way to the holy temple of God and ceremonial washing and cleansing and blessing to partake the Paschal Lamb of God. But here you are compelled to carry that godless, defiling, anti-religious, humiliating obscenity in the opposite direction. Every step you're forced to take is one step further from your goal to be in the presence of God. Talk about an epic irony. Right? There's so many levels of irony too. I mean, it's just like, well, Jesus, as he entered Jerusalem, cursed the fig tree because the fig tree represents the temple. Temple bears no fruit. And he is the new temple. So here's Simon going to the temple, but got conscripted, going the opposite direction, not knowing that actually he is with the temple. There's so many irony in all of this. But isn't that precisely the kind of thing the gospel does to all of us, though? You may say, well, what do you mean? Well, you came here on Palm Sunday for the children's parade, right? But you get a lesson on degrading cross. What I mean is that we all want to go the direction of upward mobility. The gospel takes us instead in the direction of downward mobility. We want social currency. The gospel gives us stench. For example, remember the Corinthian church. They believe in Jesus, but they wanted to go the direction of upward mobility and social currency. They wanted to be seen as, they want to have certain prestige. They want to outplay the Jews who look for power in the power game. They want to outplay the Greeks who look for wisdom in the wisdom game. The Corinthians were culturally sophisticated, rhetorically impressive, and probably aesthetically pleasing group of Christians. They were so gifted. And you can kind of see the implication from Paul's letter. They were so gifted that they had their own plan to attract both the Jews and the Greeks, the religious and the secular, all by themselves. Now, unfortunately, here comes Paul, the guy who actually founded the church. And he is anything but impressive or eloquent or even spiritually attractive. And that's part of the criticism they have for Paul. He keeps hampering on this embarrassing and humiliating and obscene and not so attractive subject of the cross. I mean, he's going in the opposite direction of where they wanted to go. They were going one way, he's heading the other way. He's heading outside of the city, metaphorically speaking. That's just not the direction of the intuition. Now, isn't that the kind of things the gospel does? It takes us where we don't want to go. Now listen to how the cross takes us where we don't want to go. But counterintuitively, that's precisely the direction we need to go if we want to be with God. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 24. So listen. The words are small, but you can listen. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ, notice, Christ, not just Christ, but Christ crucified. A stumbling block to the Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now this has all kind of profound implication for all of us, not just in the season of division, of partisan, of deconstruction, election. As Christians, the cross is in all of our future. I wouldn't let you go without reviewing the cross chart. As you know, there's a beginning point, When we became aware that it's a difference between God's holiness and our brokenness, and the cross is what bridges. But the cross also means this. We have lost, actually, a grasp of what it actually meant at the time. But that cross is in all of our future. Yes, it represents the love of God. But there's a stench as well. And it is in our future, whether we choose it or not, the stigma, the stench, the weakness, the shame. And all of that is going to be part of our story. It's going to be part of our story because that's what Jesus is, not in the parade, but in the procession to Golgotha. Without Calvary, there will be no Easter. And the cross is a totally counterintuitive path. God is often not where we think he is. I don't know which direction you're heading. But I do know this. I know his message to you is this: take up your cross and go the direction of Jesus. Now, there's another sense. The cross is in all of our future, even if we don't choose it, even if we don't believe in Jesus or God or a religious thing, even if you're here simply because this is just the things to do during the season of the year. You see, we may not choose suffering, but suffering and death will choose us. Jonathan Edwards used to say what happened to Job in one day will happen to all of us in our lifetime. And that is true. The loss of property, the loss of loved ones, the loss of health, whether we want it or not. Even if you're not a follower of Jesus, even if you want to stay away from the cross, even if suffering is not part of your past or your present, it will be in your future. Because we are broken people living in a broken world, and brokenness results in suffering and death. There's just no way to extricate ourselves from the messiness of sin. We all have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. Our problem really is immense, and the cost is steep. And you only need to look at the severe nature of Jesus' cross to get a sense of the severity of our problem. Suffering, then, is in all of our future, one way or the other. Now, if that sounds depressing, there is good news. The good news is that Jesus has drunk the cup that we cannot drink, that he has borne the full weight of our sin on the cross. And if you were trusting him, suffering and death will not have the final word. Yes, suffering and death will come, but they are now repurposed to serve a different story. And what a total different story it is. Now, when we think about the year 2024, this is a community that has known suffering, isn't it? Every week. One of the reasons I love Grace Covenant so much is that this is a family that is touched by suffering and is familiar with pain. Every week, the list of our prayer meeting grows longer and longer. Diseases, weaknesses, big and small. Teeth, feet, eyes, knees, backs, ribs, hearts, cancer, chronic illnesses, pain that refuses to go away, relational crises, faith crises, emotional and mental health struggles, jobs, finances, abuses, and death. We've lost some of our dearest brothers and sisters, haven't we? But suffering and death no longer have the final word. There's that downward path. There's that downward path of dying every day, sure. But if we willingly live into that story, into Jesus' story, our cross is no longer about wrath or punishment, but it is a new path, a path to a new life. You see, if we are united to Jesus, to his suffering and death, we will also be united to his resurrection. And there is the Paul Miller's J. Kurt, for those of you who came to the Praying Life seminar. That's what he meant by J. Kurt, by the way. There's a downward path of dying every day. But there's also resurrection, rising again. There's a reason, I believe, that God chooses this path for all of us. He chooses this path for all of us because Jesus, he didn't come to improve our own life. He didn't come so that we can be improved as persons. No, he came to kill our old self so he can give us an entirely different kind of life and be an entirely different kind of person. And if we willingly unite with him in this death to self, we will also be raised with him to his new life. And raised to new life, that is what Easter is all about. And Pastor Tim will take it from here next week. Let's pray together. Father, our hope is not simply for a better life than the one that we have. Our hope is not simply that we will see improvement. But the real hope is when we realize that we're done with this life of brokenness, this life of shame, this life of weakness, and this life of sin and messiness. And our hope is that with Jesus, we will put to death, we will be dying to our old self every day, that we may also be raised with him in his new life. And we thank you. Help us to live into that new story, to realize that our sin, our suffering, the pain and death, which we still all going to be in all of our future, they are now repurposed for a different story. So we praise you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.